The neighborhood was ordinary, a patchwork of modest houses where people went about their daily lives without much excitement. But at the far end of the street stood a house that had long unsettled its neighbors. It belonged to Janice Porter, a middle-aged woman who rarely spoke to anyone and seemed to exist behind drawn curtains and locked doors. The grass in her yard grew tall in the summer, and during the colder months, smoke from her chimney carried a sour scent that lingered in the air. People whispered about her, calling her odd, but no one had reason to think she was dangerous. Most assumed she was simply lonely, a woman who preferred silence to conversation. For years, the house was just part of the background, something to look at and then forget. But everything changed the morning a delivery driver parked in front of the property. He had come to drop off a routine package. As he stepped from his truck, his nose caught a foul odor that seemed to seep from the house itself. It wasn't the smell of garbage or spoiled food, though those possibilities came to mind at first. This odor was heavier, pungent, and clung to his clothes even after he returned to his vehicle. Disturbed, he quickly left the package on the porch, but the stench followed him back into his truck. He rolled down the windows and gagged, realizing it wasn't normal. When he radioed his supervisor to report it, the decision was made to contact the authorities. It was, at first, believed to be a welfare concern. Perhaps the resident had fallen ill or worse. No one suspected what the reality would be. When officers arrived, they immediately noticed the same sour air. It was thick, almost metallic, as if something rotting was being cooked and recycled through the vents. One officer knocked on the door, then again, louder, but no answer came. The windows were shut, the curtains still drawn, and the silence inside was absolute. After several minutes, they made the call to enter. Using a crowbar, they forced the door open, and instantly the odor doubled in strength. It poured out like a living thing, filling the street and forcing one of the officers to cover his face with his sleeve. They hesitated at the threshold, knowing what awaited them inside would not be ordinary. The living room was the first to greet them, and it was a disaster. Stacks of newspapers leaned against collapsing piles of junk. Old food containers littered the carpet, and stains coated the furniture. The house looked less like a home and more like a place abandoned for years, yet the air carried a hint of something fresh, something cooking. Following the faint hiss of boiling water, the officers made their way to the kitchen. It was dim, the only light coming from the dull glow of the stove. There, on a dirty burner, sat a massive soup pot. Steam curled upward, coating the greasy window with condensation. The room was suffocatingly hot, the smell unbearable, and yet the pot bubbled steadily as though someone had just walked away from it. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, realizing they had stumbled onto something far more sinister than a welfare check. The officers stood frozen in the kitchen, the heat pressing against their skin and the smell clawing at their throats. The pot seemed ordinary at first glance, a large metal vessel that could have been used for stew or broth, but something about it felt wrong. The liquid inside was too thick, its surface glistening with a greasy sheen that looked more like oil than soup. The steady bubbling made the silence of the house even more unsettling, as though the entire structure had been waiting for them to arrive. One officer, struggling against instinct, reached for the handle. The lid was hot to the touch, and the moment it was lifted, the truth revealed itself. What floated inside was not food. Beneath the rising steam, pale flesh bobbed to the surface. Fingers curled unnaturally, swollen from the heat. The unmistakable shape of a human hand drifted upward before sinking back beneath the dark broth. The officer recoiled instantly, the lid clattering to the floor with a deafening crash. The other covered his mouth, fighting back the urge to vomit. The reality was undeniable. They had stumbled onto a crime scene unlike any they had ever encountered. This was not just death. This was desecration. They backed away from the stove, and one officer scrambled for his radio, his voice shaking as he called in what they had found. Ew. The words were difficult to say out loud. A hand, a human hand in a soup pot. The message was received with stunned silence before reinforcements and forensic teams were dispatched immediately. Until help arrived, the officers were ordered to secure the scene, though every second in that house felt unbearable. The kitchen offered more clues. Beside the stove sat a cutting board, stained dark as though it had been used to prepare raw meat. A butcher's knife, its blade nicked and dulled, was left nearby, resting on a stack of dirty plates. In the sink, cloudy water concealed something large and the drain stank of blood that had long since clotted. Everywhere they looked, the ordinary was twisted into something grotesque. Nothing belonged in the context of a normal home, yet everything was presented as if it did. When backup finally arrived, the house transformed into a scene of controlled chaos. Detectives, crime scene photographers, and forensic specialists poured inside, each one recoiling at the smell and the sight of the pot. Gloves snapped onto hands, cameras flashed, and evidence bags began filling with whatever could be salvaged. It was then that the freezer was opened, revealing more than anyone had been prepared for. Wrapped in butcher paper and sealed with tape, packages lay stacked neatly, almost like cuts of meat from a store. But beneath the paper was flesh, unmistakably human. Oh, the horror spread quickly through the team, and word traveled fast beyond the house. Officers outside whispered to one another, unable to contain their disbelief. Neighbors gathered at the end of the street, drawn by flashing lights and the rising panic in the air. None of them could have imagined that the reclusive woman in the brick house had been living among them with such a gruesome secret simmering on her stove. For investigators, one thing was certain. This discovery was only the beginning, and the truth behind it would be darker than anyone dared to imagine. Detectives worked tirelessly through the night, combing through every inch of the house in search of answers. The kitchen was the epicenter of horror, but as they moved deeper into the property, the unease only grew stronger. The freezer had already revealed its sickening contents, but the basement became an even darker discovery. Down a creaking flight of stairs, investigators found rows of bleach bottles lined against the wall, as if purchased in bulk for a singular purpose. Plastic tubs were scattered across the concrete floor, some stained with streaks of reddish-brown. A large workbench sat against one side, covered in tools that looked less like household items and more like the equipment of a butcher. Each piece was tagged as evidence, the grim puzzle slowly forming in the minds of those present. The question looming over everyone was who the victim might be. At first, there was speculation about whether the remains belonged to one person or several. The packages in the freezer differed in size and shape, and the condition of the body parts in the soup pot left it difficult to determine. Forensic teams carefully collected everything, documenting each step, while detectives began searching for missing persons reports in the area that might match the timeline. The most troubling aspect of the case was that Janice Porter, the homeowner, was nowhere to be found. Neighbors were questioned immediately. Some admitted they hadn't seen her in weeks. Others recalled strange details that only now seemed significant. One woman mentioned hearing chopping noises late at night, so loud she thought someone was repairing furniture. Another spoke of the smell that had lingered for days, growing worse with each passing evening. Yet no one had reported it sooner, assuming it was spoiled food or perhaps an animal that had died in the walls. Regret spread among them as they realized what those signs truly meant. Investigators dug deeper into Janice's life. Records showed she had lived in the house alone for nearly 15 years after inheriting it from her parents. She had no close family, no spouse, and no children. Financial records painted a picture of instability, debts piled high, unpaid bills, and an irregular work history that included stints at grocery stores, diners, and a meatpacking plant. That last detail disturbed detectives the most. If she had once worked around raw meat and butchering, it suggested she had the knowledge and skill to carry out what had been discovered in her kitchen. While detectives tried to untangle her history, the forensic lab worked quickly to identify the remains. Dental records were pulled, DNA samples processed, and comparisons made against the growing list of missing people. Every hour mattered, not only because of the horror already uncovered, but because Janice Porter herself was still missing. If she had fled, the danger was far from over. The investigation turned the once quiet street into a crime scene swarming with activity. Reporters camped at the edges, neighbors locked their doors, and the entire community held its breath, waiting for answers. The grim reality was setting in. Janice had not been preparing food at all. She had been disposing of a body in plain sight, boiling the evidence as though it were nothing more than a meal. The mystery now was not just how she had done it, but why, and whether more victims remained hidden. The breakthrough in the case came after days of tense waiting. Forensic scientists were finally able to piece together enough evidence to identify the victim. Dental records confirmed that the remains belonged to Helen Drake, a 51-year-old nurse who had been reported missing just a month earlier. Helen was known throughout the community for her kindness and her steady presence at the local clinic. She had no criminal record, no history of risky behavior, and no reason to simply disappear. The revelation of her fate sent shockwaves not just through the investigation but through the entire town. Detectives quickly turned their attention to the connection between Helen and Janice Porter. It did not take long to discover that the two women had once been friends. They were seen together frequently years earlier, often shopping or attending local events, but something had changed between them. Interviews with acquaintances painted a picture of a friendship that had soured dramatically. Helen had lent Janice several $1,000s during a difficult period, and when Janice failed to repay her, the situation escalated. Witnesses recalled a heated argument outside a grocery store where Helen accused Janice of betrayal. After that day, they were never seen together again. The financial motive was clear, but it did not explain the brutality of the crime. Why would Janice not only kill Helen, but go to such lengths to dismember and boil her remains? Detectives theorized that Janice may have attempted to conceal the body by destroying the evidence. Cooking the remains in liquid could have been her way of breaking them down, making disposal easier and masking the smell for as long as possible. But instead of hiding her actions, she had created a horror so extreme that even seasoned investigators struggled to comprehend it. The timeline of Helen's disappearance fit neatly into the puzzle. She had been last seen leaving her job late one evening, planning to stop by Janice's house on her way home. Phone records confirmed she had received a call from Janice that same night. What began as a confrontation about money had spiraled into violence, leaving Helen at the mercy of a woman whose bitterness had been festering for years. As this picture of the crime formed, the search for Janice became more desperate. Warrants were issued nationwide, her photograph plastered on news stations and newspapers across the country. Communities were warned to be on the lookout, as authorities believed she might still be armed and dangerous. What terrified people most was the idea that she had carried out such a crime in silence, hidden in plain sight among them. The town that once dismissed her as a reclusive neighbor now saw her as something else entirely, a predator capable of unimaginable cruelty. The image of Helen Drake, a nurse who had dedicated her life to helping others, contrasted painfully with the woman accused of boiling her remains. The case no longer felt like a distant crime story. It had become personal to everyone who lived nearby, a reminder that evil could grow quietly behind closed curtains and go unnoticed until it was too late. Janice Porter was eventually tracked down after weeks of searching that stretched across several states. Investigators followed a trail of small clues, credit card activity under false names, witness tips about a woman paying cash for motel rooms, and surveillance footage showing her boarding buses late at night. Her final hideout was discovered in a decaying roadside motel hundreds of miles from the town she had fled. When officers entered her room, they found her living under an assumed identity, using fake documents and keeping to herself, just as she had back home. The arrest was swift, but the scene inside revealed more than just a fugitive in hiding. A small notebook lay on the nightstand, filled with her writings. What the pages contained was even more disturbing than the crime itself. The entries were meticulous and obsessive. Janice had written about a purifying the body, a boiling away sins, and a reducing the soul to silence. Each page read like a set of rituals rather than simple thoughts. The investigators realized they were dealing not only with a killer, but with someone whose mind had fractured into dangerous obsession. The notebook became central evidence in the trial, showing her intent and state of mind. These weren't the panicked scrawls of someone covering up a mistake. They were methodical instructions for carrying out acts of horror. When Janice was finally brought back to face justice, the trial drew national attention. Courtrooms filled with reporters, and every detail of the case was dissected in headlines. Prosecutors painted her as a woman consumed by resentment and desperation. They presented the financial conflict with Helen Drake as the initial motive, but emphasized that the crime went far beyond money. They argued that Janice's actions revealed a disturbing fascination with control, destruction, and ritual. The defense tried to argue mental illness, pointing to the bizarre writings in her notebook and her reclusive lifestyle. But the jury saw her not as someone unaware of her choices, but as a calculating figure who knew exactly what she was doing. The testimony from forensic experts gripped the courtroom. They described in detail how the body had been dismembered, how the pot on the stove was used to break down flesh, and how the packages in the freezer had been carefully wrapped to resemble ordinary food. Each description made jurors and spectators shudder, and many found it difficult to sit through the proceedings. The evidence was overwhelming, and the image of that bubbling pot became the defining symbol of the case. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than a day. They returned with a unanimous verdict of guilty on charges of first-degree murder and abuse of a corpse. Janice Porter was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge, in his closing remarks, described the crime as one of the most grotesque acts ever to come before the court. Even after her sentencing, the memory of the case lingered. For the community, the image of that house at the end of the quiet street was forever stained. Neighbors admitted they would never again pass by without recalling the smell, the silence, and the discovery that turned their world upside down. For many, even something as simple as the sight of a soup pot would forever be linked to the unimaginable horror that Janice Porter had created behind her closed doors.